Under the cloak of a moonless night, a handful of Allied commandos slipped through the forests of occupied France. Their target, a top-secret German radar station that could see every Allied bomber in the sky. One misstep, and 200 soldiers, and the fate of the air war, would be lost forever. The forests of northern France lay under a heavy, watchful silence. Late autumn of 1943 had turned the countryside into a patchwork of amber leaves and frostbitten fields, yet beneath the seeming tranquility lurked a tension that was palpable to anyone who had learned to read the signs of occupation. Villagers huddled under strict curfews, their cobblestone streets empty by dusk, shuttered windows trembling under the occasional blast of a German patrol truck's engine. The air carried the smell of wood smoke, horse manure, and the ever-present metallic tang of fear. Every footstep on the gravel seemed amplified, every rustle of the trees a potential harbinger of discovery. France was no longer just a land of rolling fields and quiet hamlets. It was a fortress under invisible siege, its skies watched by an enemy whose eyes were not human. High atop the ridges, behind the skeletal frames of radar towers, the Luftwaffe had woven an early warning network that stretched from the channel ports to the heart of Normandy. These installations, with their giant rotating antennas and blinking dials, could detect incoming Allied bombers hundreds of kilometers away. Every raid, every sortie, risked annihilation before the bombers even reached their targets. The Allies had learned this the hard way. Each campaign carried with it a mounting tally of losses. Crews shot down in fiery arcs across the sky, planes splintered and twisted on the ground, and the grim tally of lives extinguished far from home. In London, at the War Office, commanders pored over maps and intelligence reports. The dilemma was clear, the solution less so. Bombing campaigns were essential, yet the existing tactics had proven catastrophically vulnerable. Something drastic, something audacious, was required to crack the code of Germany's radar dominance. Into this calculus of desperation stepped a small, highly specialized unit, a handful of men and women whose skills were as varied as they were lethal. Among them was a British officer, a master of engineering and stealth, whose mind could unravel the most sophisticated mechanisms and find their hidden flaws. Alongside him was a French resistance liaison, a woman whose intimate knowledge of the countryside, the secret paths through villages, and the ever-shifting patterns of German patrols made her indispensable. Together, they embodied the Allies' gamble, brains and courage against a mechanized gaze that never blinked. Preparation was painstaking. Maps were studied, routes memorized, contingencies planned down to the second. Each member understood the stakes. Capture meant not just death, but the potential unraveling of months of strategic planning. And yet, there was a thrill, a quiet, nervous exhilaration, in attempting the impossible. Their mission was unprecedented, a delicate dance of infiltration, sabotage, and survival, set against the backdrop of a war that had already devoured millions. Even as they trained, even as the plans took shape in shadowed rooms far from the front lines, the enormity of the challenge loomed. Across northern France, radar towers bristled like metal sentinels, their rotating dishes casting long shadows over fields and villages alike. A fortress, invisible, yet watching every sky, one officer murmured, reading the intelligence reports aloud, a whisper that carried the weight of dread and anticipation. They were about to step into a world where every decision, every misstep, could be fatal, and yet, success could alter the very course of the air war over Europe. The forests awaited, the villages slept uneasily, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the watchful eyes of the enemy scanned the skies. In the stillness of the northern French night, the horizon was alive with invisible threats. Above the frostbitten fields, Allied bombers traced ghostly paths across the stars, unaware that every movement was being watched by instruments designed with terrifying precision. The Germans called them the Freya and Würzburg systems, radars that had transformed the skies over occupied Europe into a lethal chessboard. The Freya, a long-range early warning radar, could detect aircraft up to 120 miles away, its giant lattice towers rotating steadily under the moonlight. Once a blip appeared, the Würzburg radar, with its tighter beam and shorter range, would lock onto the target with astonishing accuracy, guiding flak batteries and night fighters with near-perfect precision. Every Allied formation that thought itself safe above the clouds was actually crossing a battlefield mapped in invisible beams of energy, calculated by men who had come to trust the unerring eyes of their machines. Inside the radar bunkers, the atmosphere was starkly mechanical, yet undeniably human. Operators, young men barely out of their teens, sat at polished wooden consoles cluttered with dials, switches, and blinking lights. The constant hum of the equipment filled the air, punctuated by the occasional metallic whir of a rotating antenna. Discipline was absolute. Each movement, each observation logged in thick ledgers, the data transmitted upward to Luftwaffe command. Yet within this regimented world, human quirks still emerged. Rivalries over shift rotations, subtle jokes whispered during long watches, a bemused grin at a colleague's clumsy attempt to calibrate a dial, moments of mundane humanity amidst a deadly task. Many believed themselves untouchable, the invisible shields of technology granting a sense of invincibility. But these instruments, as precise and cold as they were, bore consequences that were heartbreakingly human. Over the autumn months of 1943, every radar station's report translated into real losses in the skies above France and the Low Countries. The Royal Air Force's Lancaster bombers and American B-17 flying fortresses, once confident in their altitude and formation, were now sitting targets for well-coordinated night fighters and flak barrages. Crews burned in the dark, parachutes drifting uselessly to frozen fields, while others were captured, their fate sealed in German POW camps. For the men in the radar bunkers, these outcomes were a measure of professional pride, a confirmation that their work had not been in vain, a grim testament to the lethal partnership between human skill and machine precision. Life inside the bunkers was both tense and monotonous. The operators moved in rhythmic routines, scanning the screens, recording data, reporting anomalies. Outside, the antennae sliced the night sky in silent arcs, their shadows stretching over the fields like skeletal fingers. A half-full coffee cup, a cigarette glowing briefly in the dark, the scratch of pencil on paper, small human details that punctuated the lethal regularity of their work. They were engineers of death, yet also teenagers, brothers, and sons, trapped in a system that demanded perfection and delivered consequences in lives lost or saved above the clouds. Allied intelligence had been watching as carefully as the Germans watched the skies. Reconnaissance planes, flying at the edge of detection, photographed the radar stations, noting every tower, every antenna, every defensive emplacement. Reports filtered back to London, locations confirmed, defensive strength estimated, blind spots mapped. For the small commando unit preparing to strike, the reports crystallized the reality. This mission was no longer a theoretical gamble. The time to act had arrived. Every hesitation risked another raid being slaughtered, another crew lost to the unblinking eyes of the enemy. The stakes had never been higher. The Freya and Würzburg stations were more than metal and electricity. They were the very eyes of death in the night sky. And now, armed with knowledge, the Allies faced a choice that could not be postponed. The mission, once dangerous, had become urgent, a single window of opportunity against a network that watched relentlessly, waiting for the slightest mistake. Night settled over the French countryside like a curtain of ink, sealing the world in silence. In an abandoned barn miles from the nearest paved road, the Allied commando team prepared for the most critical phase of their mission. Under the dim glow of a covered lantern, maps were spread across wooden crates, thin sheets annotated with charcoal markings showing patrol routes, elevation lines, radio towers, and the narrow forest corridor that led to the German radar station. Every man studied them with the focus of someone memorizing the path between life and death. Silenced Sten guns and revolvers were laid out carefully, checked and rechecked. Plastic explosive slabs, Nobel 808, were wrapped in cloth to prevent sound, each fitted with pencil detonators calibrated down to the minute. Coded signals were whispered again, 2 taps for halt, 3 for danger, 1 long press of the radio key for an emergency extraction request that everyone hoped would never be needed. Their equipment was simple, compact, and unforgiving. There would be no second chances if something malfunctioned. The tension in the room was unmistakable. Fear lingered not as panic, but as a cold edge sharpening every sense. A single mistake could doom not only the mission but also the French resistance network supporting them. Everyone knew what the Germans did to captured saboteurs. Even in whispers, no one spoke of it. Yet amid the fear, there was camaraderie, the quiet assurance of men who had trained together, endured together, and now stepped into the unknown together. A nod from one to another. A steadying hand as gear was adjusted. A shared look that said more than words ever could. When the moment came, they moved like shadows slipping through the barn door and out into the frigid night. Frost coated the ground. Their breaths formed brief white clouds before vanishing in the darkness. The forest swallowed them quickly, its skeletal branches rattling softly in the wind. Every crunch of leaves underfoot, every snapped twig, felt impossibly loud. Ahead, German patrols swept the area in rotating patterns. Searchlights from the radar compound cut through the treetops in broad, sweeping arcs, illuminating clouds of mist drifting low to the ground. The men froze each time the beams passed, pressing themselves into the earth, counting the rhythm of light and shadow. Distant sounds carried unnervingly well: boots on gravel, a dog barking somewhere near a farmstead, the low murmur of soldiers speaking in clipped German. Even the mechanical creak of the Freya's rotating antenna could be heard faintly across the cold air, like a giant turning its head, listening. The team advanced in disciplined silence, crouching beneath fallen logs, moving along frozen ditches, and slipping between thickets of pine. Their French liaison led the way, her intimate knowledge of the forest paths reducing the risks, but never eliminating them. Several times they halted as patrols passed close enough that they could smell the cigarette smoke drifting from the soldiers' uniforms. Hours became a blur of slow, deliberate steps. Each man pushed aside the growing ache in his legs and the numbing cold in his fingers. Fatigue meant carelessness. Carelessness meant death. Then, at the forest's edge, they saw it. A guard post, closer and more heavily manned than intelligence reports had indicated. 2 sentries stood by a sandbagged position, illuminated faintly by a shielded lantern. Another paced slowly along a wire fence. Their rifles slung casually over their shoulders suggested routine confidence, but their presence was unexpected, a sign that German vigilance was tightening. The commandos sank into the shadows, hearts pounding. The path they had planned to take ran directly past this outpost. One wrong move here could unravel everything, bringing German reinforcements crashing into the forest, sealing the fate of the mission before it had even begun. The night felt suddenly smaller, the danger sharper. They had reached the threshold of the radar station's outer ring of defenses. And now, the next step would determine whether they slipped through unseen, or vanished into the darkness forever. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the commandos approached the edge of the radar compound. Moonlight glinted off the steel of rifles and the pale canvas of packs, but the shadows were their allies. Every step was measured, every heartbeat synchronized with the silent rhythm of the mission. The target was clear: disable the Freya and Würzburg radars, cut communications, and leave before the Germans could summon reinforcements. The stakes were nothing less than the survival of hundreds of Allied bomber crews over Europe. Inside the compound, the night air was thick with tension. Fingers pressed triggers of silenced Sten guns, knives glinted briefly in the dim glow of lanterns, and small explosive charges were readied. Sweat stung eyes from exertion and nerves, breaths came in shallow, controlled gasps, and each whispered order carried the weight of life or death. Now, left flank, murmured the British officer, and the team melted into the shadows, ghosts among the trees. They struck swiftly. A sentry was overpowered with a practiced hand, a knife to the throat, movement so precise it barely disturbed the crisp night air. Another fell silently to a Sten's suppressed report, landing without a sound. In the command center, the French resistance operative worked quickly, her hands steady despite the adrenaline, cutting wires that linked the radar tower to its generator. Sparks hissed as circuits died, plunging part of the compound into near darkness. The air was alive with the scent of ozone, cordite, and fear. But perfection was never guaranteed. A sudden movement, a sentry glancing around, triggered an alarm too quickly. German soldiers shouted into the night, boots pounding the gravel, rifles snapping into action. The commandos were pinned behind sandbags and low walls, hearts hammering, muscles coiled for instantaneous action. The forest beyond seemed to close in, shadows twisting into threats as flares lit the perimeter. One moment crystallized the danger. A comrade, caught in the open, was exposed to a burst of machine gun fire. Without hesitation, another team member lunged across the frozen ground, dragging him into cover as bullets whistled past. Breaths ragged, adrenaline surging, they moved like predators and prey in the same heartbeat, fear and courage inseparable. Nearby, the French operative detonated a second charge beneath the radar generator. The night erupted in a muffled roar, wires and metal twisting as the tower went dark. The lights that had once scanned the sky with lethal certainty were extinguished, but the sound was unmistakable, carrying alarm to every garrison in the surrounding countryside. Each decision was instant. Each action weighted with consequence. A misfired explosive could mean the difference between quiet success and a flood of reinforcements converging in minutes. Every heartbeat, every suppressed whisper, every step across frost-hardened earth was magnified in importance. There was no margin for error, no time to hesitate. In the chaos, the commandos moved with a deadly choreography, suppressing small pockets of resistance, smashing communication lines, and ensuring that nothing essential remained intact. They were in and out, but not without cost. Dust, smoke, and sparks blurred the edges of the night, and for a fleeting moment, the forest itself seemed to recoil at the violence. Then came the final orders, retreat. Flames licked the radar compound, red and orange tongues devouring the metal and wood that had once made the Germans' unblinking eyes. Sirens shrieked, a rising cacophony that promised swift pursuit. The team exfiltrated through the tree line, moving low and fast, bodies pressed into the frost-hardened undergrowth, every sense alert for the sound of a pursuing patrol. The forest swallowed them once more, but the night remained alive with tension. Somewhere behind them, the radar station burned, sending plumes of smoke into the moonlit sky, alarms echoing like distant thunder. Success was uncertain. How much had been destroyed, how many German reinforcements would converge, and whether the destruction would be enough to protect the next Allied raid were questions only time could answer. Yet in those few minutes of chaos and courage, the mission had achieved something profound. Small decisions, who to neutralize first, when to detonate explosives, when to pull back, had cascaded into consequences that could shift the course of an entire campaign. Fear and skill, courage and precision, human intuition and mechanical destruction had collided in the dark, leaving behind only smoke, silence, and the echo of a plan daringly executed. As the commandos disappeared into the forest, the night seemed to exhale, leaving behind the smell of gunpowder and a horizon suddenly freer of the invisible eyes that had once tracked the skies with deadly certainty. But the war was far from over, and the consequences of their raid would only reveal themselves in the days to come. Dawn broke over the English Channel in a soft haze of gold and grey, illuminating airfields that had been thrumming with tension for months. At RAF stations from Lincolnshire to Norfolk, bomber crews readied their aircraft for another grueling sortie over occupied Europe. The constant fear that had haunted them for over a year, the sudden scream of flak, the thunder of Luftwaffe interceptors appearing from nowhere, had lessened. Something had changed, though none of the men yet fully understood why. Over northern France, the radar network that had once acted as the Germans' unblinking eye was dark. The Freya and Würzburg stations, pillars of detection and control, had been reduced to smouldering ruins. For the first time in months, bomber formations flew with a fraction of the usual anxiety, their survival rates noticeably higher. Statistical analyses circulated quietly among high command. Sorties that had once suffered 40% losses now returned largely intact. Hundreds of men who might have burned in the night or parachuted into frozen fields were coming home. Intelligence reports filtered in with methodical precision. Photographs taken by reconnaissance planes confirmed the devastation. Metal towers twisted, generators destroyed, communication lines severed. The Germans, once confident in the invulnerability of their radar defenses, were now scrambling. The Luftwaffe High Command ordered immediate reconstruction, diverting engineers and resources to rebuild what had been lost. For weeks, radar coverage over the Channel and northern France would be patchy at best, a rare and crucial advantage for the Allies. Meanwhile, the human cost and reward of the raid was not abstract. The commandos emerged from the French forests days later, bruised, exhausted, and battle-worn. Muscle aches, frostbite, and minor injuries were catalogued silently, but the emotional toll was heavier. Men who had spent hours inches from death, listening to alarms and suppressing the instinct to flinch under fire, were now processing a mixture of relief and lingering tension. For some, the adrenaline still thrummed in their veins, making sleep shallow, dreams vivid with flashes of gunfire and exploding generators. For others, there was quiet pride, a sense of having accomplished what few could even imagine possible. Camaraderie, forged in the cold, dark forest, held them together. A shared glance, a hand on a shoulder, a wordless acknowledgement of survival spoke louder than any medal. They had infiltrated, fought, and destroyed a key element of the German defensive network, and in doing so, had shifted the air war over Europe. Every bomber that now returned safely owed a debt to their courage, precision, and unyielding nerve. Yet even amidst this temporary triumph, the shadow of retribution loomed. German engineers worked furiously, reinforcing other radar sites, establishing patrol patterns, and promising retaliation for the audacity of the raid. Luftwaffe officers warned that the Allies' window of advantage was fleeting. Every day the commandos delayed, every hour the radar network was repaired, narrowed the margin for success in the air campaign. The psychological stakes of operating behind enemy lines were now fully etched into the memory of the men. Fear had been constant. Now, relief was tempered with the understanding that danger never truly ended. In London, High Command quietly adjusted bombing schedules, capitalizing on the temporary gap in German surveillance, while across the Channel, German generals seethed at the vulnerability that had been exposed. The raid had succeeded in destroying a critical node of the Luftwaffe's defenses. The air war was beginning to turn. The Allies could strike with new confidence, and bomber crews, for the first time in months, glimpsed the possibility of survival over occupied Europe. Yet, in the shadowed bunkers and command posts behind enemy lines, German voices vowed vengeance. Rebuilds would begin, defences would be shored up, and the struggle for the skies over France was far from over. From the quiet of their airfields, Allied crews sensed it instinctively. The battle for control of the skies had shifted, but the war, relentless and unforgiving, was only entering a new, more dangerous phase. The calm that followed the destruction of the radar station was deceptive. Across northern France, shadows lengthened not only over forests and fields but over the hearts of civilians who had lived under occupation for years. German high command reacted swiftly and brutally. Patrols increased along every forest path, checkpoints multiplied in villages, and nighttime sweeps became routine. Soldiers searched homes, barns, and attics, interrogating anyone suspected of aiding the Commandos. Resistance networks, already operating on the edge of survival, were forced to scatter, abandoning safe houses and leaving trusted operatives vulnerable. Rumors spread like wildfire. Executions of suspected collaborators or informants were carried out in the open as examples, leaving communities paralyzed with fear. Dogs barked in abandoned courtyards, searchlights cut through misty streets, and the simple act of movement became a test of nerve. For the French civilians who had quietly helped the Allied operatives, guiding them through forest paths, supplying food, or relaying intelligence, the line between loyalty and death had never felt so thin. The mission's success had unintended consequences, and the cost was already being counted in human lives. Within the commando ranks, the weight of responsibility was palpable. They had struck a decisive blow against the Luftwaffe, yet the knowledge that civilians now suffered because of their actions gnawed at them. Sitting in the shadow of a bombed-out barn days after the raid, some wrestled with the morality of sabotage. Could the destruction of a radar tower be justified when families were caught in the crossfire? When a village paid a price for the calculations of war? The psychological toll of operating behind enemy lines was compounded now by these questions. Questions with no easy answers, questions whose echoes would linger long after the smoke cleared. Yet strategically, the raid's effect was undeniable. Intelligence assessments confirmed that radar reconstruction would take months. The Freya and Würzburg systems had been reduced to rubble. Spare components were scarce, and German engineers faced logistical delays compounded by Allied bombing of rail lines and factories. For the Allies, this was a rare and invaluable window. Bomber formations, previously harried and decimated by sophisticated early warning networks, now had a brief period of relative safety. The destruction had shifted not only the tactical balance in northern France but the broader strategic calculus of the air war over Europe. Still, even with this advantage, the mission's shadow lingered. Commandos returned to friendly territory exhausted, carrying minor injuries, frostbite, and the memory of gunfire and explosions. Their hearts remained tethered to the forests and villages behind enemy lines, to the civilians who had helped them and now faced heightened scrutiny and danger. The lines between right and wrong, heroism and consequence, had blurred. Operational success had come a moral cost, and every step forward carried the knowledge that the war exacted payment in human suffering, sometimes from those the Allies sought to protect. Across the occupied countryside, German forces were rebuilding defences, reinforcing patrols, and enhancing communication protocols. Each step was measured, calculated, and fueled by vengeance. The Commandos had won the battle for the radar station, but the war for the hearts and minds of occupied France had only deepened in complexity. Fear, loyalty, and survival interwove into an uneasy mosaic, where the consequences of every action were amplified by occupation, war, and the unblinking eyes of the enemy. The raid was a tactical triumph, a blow to the Luftwaffe, and a rare victory in a brutal conflict. Yet the psychological and ethical weight of their mission would follow the Commandos indefinitely. In the forests, in the villages, and in the quiet of their own reflections, the lines between courage and cost, strategy and suffering, were indelibly drawn. The Allies now had a window to dominate the skies, but the shadows of retaliation would linger, and the human stakes of every operation remained as perilous as ever. The forest had returned to its ordinary rhythm, birdsong tentative, leaves rustling in the morning breeze, yet the men who had moved through it as shadows knew the truth. Nothing would ever feel ordinary again. Extraction was careful, deliberate. The Commandos, exhausted, frostbitten, and bruised, were guided to hidden rendezvous points, where jeeps and small boats waited to ferry them back to Allied-held territory. Every movement carried the tension of weeks compressed into hours. One misstep, one unexpected patrol, and the mission's fragile success could have been erased in an instant. Medical teams worked swiftly but quietly. Frostbite was treated with careful precision, bruises were bandaged, minor wounds cleaned and disinfected. There were no parades, no grand announcements, only the low murmur of medics and the soft clatter of stretchers in improvised field hospitals. For a brief moment, the weight of months lifted as adrenaline ebbed, leaving behind exhaustion and the quiet satisfaction of survival. Letters home were written in cramped, hurried handwriting, each word carrying the unspoken burden of what had been seen and done. Some men paused, staring at the paper, tears welling for comrades who would never return to send their own words. The quiet mourning was as real as any medal, as tangible as any citation awarded in a shadowed office. Recognition, when it came, was often modest, a whispered commendation, a folded certificate, a subtle nod from a commanding officer. But camaraderie, forged in the icy forests of northern France and tempered by fire and fear, endured far beyond official honors. The broader significance of their actions was now becoming clear. Radar towers that had once guided German night fighters and flak batteries had been destroyed, creating a temporary but decisive advantage. In the following weeks, bomber formations flew with a newfound confidence. Losses, once crippling, were dramatically reduced. Entire missions that might have ended in disaster now reached deep into German territory, striking factories, rail yards, and strategic targets with unprecedented efficiency. The raid was more than a tactical success. It had shifted the momentum of the air war over Europe, enabling the Allies to escalate bombing campaigns that would ultimately pave the way for the liberation of occupied nations. Yet even with success, the psychological imprint remained. Men whispered about what they had done, replaying decisions made in seconds that had consequences measured in lives. The quiet trauma of exposure to death and destruction lingered, threading through the long nights and restless sleep. Courage and fear were inseparable companions, and ingenuity had often carried them as far as brute strength could not. In reflection, the raid represented more than destruction. It represented a fusion of human skill and daring with strategic purpose. Small groups, operating in darkness, had altered the calculus of modern warfare. Their actions demonstrated that courage, precision, and collaboration could challenge even the most sophisticated technologies, turning fearsome instruments of control into vulnerabilities that in the shadows of medical tents and hidden airfields, in letters folded carefully and tucked into pockets, and in quiet conversations over ration tea, history quietly recorded their deeds. These men, heroes in the dark, had risked everything to change the course of a high-stakes technological war. And in that risk, in their ingenuity and sacrifice, they left a legacy that would ripple far beyond the forests of northern France and the radar towers they had destroyed. The echoes of that night in northern France reverberated far beyond the forests where the Commandos had moved like ghosts. The destruction of the radar station had not only shifted immediate tactical outcomes, it reshaped the very nature of the air war over Europe. With German early warning networks crippled, Allied planners seized the opportunity to launch large-scale bombing raids with reduced losses, striking deep into the industrial heartlands of the Reich. The fragile balance of technological power had been disrupted, and the consequences rippled across the theater of war. Radar, once thought invincible, had been rendered vulnerable by courage, stealth, and meticulous planning. Small teams, armed with little more than ingenuity, explosives, and nerves of steel, had undone months of meticulous German engineering. The paradox was stark. Human audacity had outmaneuvered mechanical precision. Where hundreds of planes might have been destroyed in a single night, the Allies now achieved missions with dramatically higher survival rates, eroding the Luftwaffe's dominance and undermining confidence in their once impenetrable air defenses. German engineers scrambled to rebuild, but every delay, every temporary blind spot, compounded the strategic advantage gained. Commando shadows in the forest had forced the enemy to expend resources they could ill afford, delaying the reconstruction of radar networks and opening a window for sustained Allied air pressure. Within months, raids over Germany became more aggressive and expansive, bombing factories, rail yards, and supply lines that were critical to the war effort. The skies of Europe were no longer fully watched, and that lapse changed the course of campaigns and, ultimately, the lives of thousands of airmen. Yet the story of the raid was not measured only in statistics or operational charts. It was a story of human bravery, ingenuity, and moral complexity. Men and women had risked everything in darkness, knowing that one misstep could result in death or the exposure of entire resistance networks. The courage displayed in those frozen forests, in the shadows of metal towers and moonlit fields, had multiplied far beyond their numbers, influencing the outcomes of campaigns in ways few could have imagined. Human action had bent the course of technological warfare, proving that even in an era dominated by machines, the judgment, creativity, and courage of individuals could tip the balance. The forests themselves seemed to remember. Smoke from the demolished radar towers lingered for days, drifting over frostbitten fields, carrying with it a silent testament to both destruction and triumph. Silhouettes of commandos, long since returned to safety, faded into dawn along forest paths, leaving behind no trace but footprints and memory. Above, Allied bombers crossed the horizon, their engines a steady reminder that the skies were now less deadly, that small acts of bravery had yielded monumental results. In the end, the legacy of fire was not merely tactical, it was symbolic. It showed that history could be shaped in shadows, that intelligence, courage, and precise execution could topple the seeming invincibility of technology. The raid left an indelible imprint, a reminder that in the vast machinery of war, human determination remained a force that could alter strategy, save lives, and echo across time. Those few who had moved through the forests, invisible yet decisive, became living proof that even the smallest acts, executed with skill and resolve, could reverberate into monumental consequences. The smoke curled into the morning sky, the frost glimmered on broken trees, and the horizon carried the promise of planes returning safely to home airfields, a silent testament to courage, ingenuity, and the enduring impact of shadows in the dark.